Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this show, I speak to those that can help us to understand the risks of human decision making and what we can do to mitigate them. And this time round, I'm coming back to explore the topic of ethics, and in particular, the concept of integrity. It's something we all intuitively understand, at least conceptually, where it exists in terms of principles such as telling the truth and keeping your word, following, if you like, the spirit as well as the letter of the law. For businesses, integrity is a real challenge because more than ever, companies are being looked at through an ethical lens. Customers, employees, investors and regulators, for starters, are increasingly looking not just at what companies do, but how they do it. And things aren't getting any easier. What we've seen under COVID is that many decisions which in quote-unquote normal times might have been ordinary course of business suddenly contain an ethical component. Deciding on which staff need to be in the office, whether or not to enforce contractual rights against a customer who can't afford to pay you, or, as I saw just last week, a newspaper genuinely having to decide whether or not to publish restaurant reviews are all ethical decisions. Technology adds an additional dynamic, as algorithms take decisions on behalf of humans, but without any pre-existing ethics programmed in, and platform businesses act as intermediaries between people without being responsible for delivery of the end product. And as trust in traditional institutions like governments, religious organizations, and higher education is in varying degrees of decline, people are often looking to their employer to provide stability, all of which means that ethics and integrity is a big issue. So I'm delighted to be joined on this episode by someone that's got first-hand experience of dealing with these issues in technology companies. Rob Chesnut is the former Chief Ethics Officer at AirBnB, and he's also worked in the legal department at eBay, where he helped devise an ethical framework. Rob has also recently published a book called Intentional Integrity that is a practical guide to solving the issues I've outlined. I invited Rob onto the show because what he wrote in his book resonated with me hugely. He's got some wonderful and not so wonderful stories about the challenges both eBay and Airbnb have faced and how they responded to them. Though what you're about to hear isn't just war stories from the front line of ethics. You'll also get some behavioral science-inspired solutions that can help mitigate one of the biggest human risk dynamics that's out there. So please enjoy my conversation on intentional integrity with Rob Chesnut. So Rob, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thanks for having me, Christian.
It's my absolute pleasure to have you. I thoroughly enjoyed reading your book because I think, as we were saying before we started recording, we are speaking the same language. But to help my listeners out, can you give them a little bit of sense of how you got into ethics, a little bit about your background?
Sure. Well, I've been dealing with rules my whole life, I think. I'm a lawyer. I was a federal prosecutor for a number of years. And then I got into the internet and was at eBay as an early employee of eBay. I'm the guy that made all the rules at eBay. I built their trust and safety department and made all the decisions around, can you sell alcohol? Can you sell scalp tickets? What can you put on the internet? I then moved on to be the general counsel of a company called Chegg and then general counsel at Airbnb. I got interested in this subject actually at Airbnb. I noticed a few years ago, Christian, I think the world's changing. I think for a long time, companies had one focus, and that was make money. And as long as you're making money, it was under this idea of shareholder value. Then everything was good. The problem with shareholder value is that you can do a lot of collateral damage along the way in your race to try to hit a quarterly number. Damage to the environment, damage to workers. And I think people, as the world is getting closer and information is getting more at their fingertips, people are getting tired of it and they want more from companies. The Me Too movement, I think, was something that I noticed when I was at Airbnb. And it struck me, wow, the world's going to be pushing us more and more to do the right thing. What can we do to get ahead of this and be proactive? And that's what sort of started the journey for me.
Amazing. And I love that transition from a discipline that is sort of, we will deal with something that's imposed on us, where it's clear, it's written down, to something that is intuitively we know is right, but it isn't codified in the same way and isn't. And the message I think that I took from your book and the way you're talking is to sort of go, okay, well, clearly we have to do what it says we're supposed to do. But actually, the world is shifting, and law and regulation by its nature is backward looking because it tends to be fighting the last war. And actually, what you're saying is let's get on the front foot and move out of this discipline of just reacting to that to say, what is it we really need to be doing? Because actually, eventually, that's going to hit the law or the regulation, but we should just get ahead of it. And actually, let's think beyond that universe and say, let's just do the right thing in the first place.
Well, it's always great to do the right thing. And doing the right thing has the additional advantage of meaning that you're going to follow the law. But that's just the low point. You can actually exceed it. And the more you try to do the right thing, the more likely it is that you're going to get the legal stuff correct. And I think, Brian, our CEO at AirBnB, talks about skating to where the puck is going. And if you can see where you think the world is moving and head there, you actually, I think, not only, I think can save a lot of time and effort, but you do the right thing for the business. And what we see, I think, is that companies that operate with integrity are benefiting financially. They outperform the market, they outperform competitors. So if you can get this right, it's actually sort of wind at your back. It can become a bit of a superpower for you as a company.
One of the things that's really obvious is we've had a lot of companies either doing a sort of ethical box ticking, right? We'll just sort of do what we need to do so that we can say we're doing it, or kind of being willfully blind to it, knowing that they're doing the wrong thing, but just kind of hoping the problem will go away. And as we know, we most of us learn this as small children. If you do that, at some point, it's going to come back and get you. But it seems to be quite a prevalent attitude. So in other words, the philosophy you're proposing is quite unusual.
It's different, right? I mean, the philosophy of I don't care. I'm just going to try to get as big as I can as a company, and I'm just going to try to make as much money as I can. I think ultimately it comes back to bite you. People ultimately don't like you. They want more from you. And I think that's a path that's going to lead to a lot of cost, a lot of regulatory issues. Your employees aren't going to be inspired by that, and your customers are ultimately going to turn away from you. The middle path is, well, we care about following the law because it's the law and we have to respect it. So let's just make a list of all the things legal, and then we'll check a box and do it just because the law says, right? So, yeah, you're right. The path I'm proposing is the third path, and that is we're going to clear that second bar of doing what the law is, but we're going to go further and do the right thing because it's right, and because, by the way, we think it's going to resonate with people and ultimately help drive the business to heights that otherwise never would have been possible.
And I think one of the really interesting things that I gleaned from your book around your experience was that you were faced with some really fascinating challenges in terms of eBay in the way that you were looking at the sorts of things that with hindsight, obviously that's going to be an issue. But actually, in terms of the practicalities, you're having to sort of almost make things up as you go along. As you sort of, well, we'll just sell anything that's legal. Tick that simple box. And then you realize after a while, as you explained, that life is a bit more complicated than that. And if you want to get this stuff right, you have to really grapple with the thorny issues.
I think early on at eBay, we took the position that we're only a platform. We're just running the computers here. What people want to put on our website, they'll put on. As long as it's legal, we don't want to be involved in making any judgments. The world didn't let us do that. The world started to push and say, hey, wait a minute. That's your company's logo up there in the frame. You're the one that's making money from this. You got to take a stand. And it was a moment, I think, in eBay's history at a board meeting when Howard Schultz, the chairman of Starbucks, had just come back from a visit to Auschwitz and raised the question of why are we selling World War II memorabilia, Nazi military items on our site. There was everything on the site, right? And people have old uniforms and old items. And he said, I'm not going to be a part of a company that's making money from this. You need to take a stand. And look, it was legal. And my initial view was, look, you can't ignore history. These are items that are important for us to have in the marketplace because we want to remember what happened so we can learn from it. And I think ultimately the company recognized that unfortunately if it's on your website, it seems to come with some sort of implied endorsement of the item. And so we decided to start making some value judgments. We started banning hate items that were offensive. I'll never forget one item we had where someone took communion from the Pope, right? And they got the wafer, the sacramental wafer from the Pope. And instead of eating it, they put it in their pocket. And then they went out and put it on eBay. And my initial reaction is, it's a wafer. Somebody really wants to buy the wafer, let them buy the wafer. But it caused an uproar. The Catholic Church started a boycott on the grounds that we were selling the body of Christ, literally, on eBay. It was highly offensive. So we ended up having to evolve our policies from it.
It's interesting, right? Because it's a really good example of something that you probably wouldn't be contemplating at the point if you're starting out, you say auction site, that is not top of the list of stuff that you think is going to happen.
No, when I first started, I literally remember when I started at eBay, there were 170 employees. And Meg Whitman looked at me and said, all right, I want you to go, you got to go make up the rules. I remember literally sitting down and thinking, okay, let's start with guns and go to alcohol and tobacco, and then we'll move from there. I hadn't gotten yet down the list to sacramental wafers and things like breast milk, another item that appeared on the site that I hadn't anticipated. Look, the world is a fascinating place, and people's imagination is endless. So you're constantly dealing with these things.
But this point around the platform kind of owns it, which I think is such a natural, obvious look through where you kind of go, doesn't matter what the law says and whatever sham thing you're hiding behind. Ultimately, you're responsible because you're putting it there and people are trusting, they're logging onto your URL in very simple terms.
Right.
And I think it's really interesting. You look at Facebook, where you've got the sort of Zuckerberg argument of we are just here to facilitate communication and allow stuff. And it's good for people to see when politicians are lying to them, which I just find is an astonishing position. You've cut straight through that and just gone, that may be the legal position, but that is just not tenable from a human perspective.
Now, what are you going to stand for? What's your North Star? It can't be just be big and make a lot of money. Mark's position is it's the First Amendment. But, my view is it has nothing to do with the First Amendment. No one is challenging someone's right to speak and say something hateful. That is protected under our First Amendment. But you don't have the right to amplify that kind of message. There's nothing in our laws that says that Facebook has to amplify and give credence to and spread that message on behalf of someone else. And by doing so, I think what is on your site becomes your brand, like it or not. And I think Facebook is learning that lesson the hard way. And other platforms have moved more quickly. I think Twitter, YouTube has put so much energy into cleaning up its platform simply because it's your brand. And what do you want to stand for at the end of the day?
Right. And of course, that's not easy. And one of the things that you explore is the practicalities of this, because starting from a principle that will allow anything if it's legal is kind of abdicating responsibility, but you can hide behind it. Theoretically, it's sort of in theory simple, although as you identify, actually practically does start to get difficult when you've got federal versus state laws that might conflict each other and a whole host of things. So even that simplified position starts to get complex.
It is complex. I remember early on, we had an issue around tickets. And, in the states, we've got 50 different states. Every state has its own law around can you resell tickets to sporting events. So I remember getting a phone call from the head law enforcement official in the state of Florida one day. He said, you all are selling tickets to the Florida football game, and you're scalping tickets, and that's illegal. And I looked at the item and I said, well, tell me, what law applies if the seller of the tickets is in Georgia, the buyer of the tickets is in Alabama, the game is played in Florida, and the servers are in California? And he laughed and I laughed, and neither one of us knew the answer. But those are the sorts of things you got to work through.
And of course, that's a digital piece. But there's an interesting bit as well that says actually, and this is something you address again in the book, is social trends are shifting. And so there's kind of a complex legal minefield there that doesn't contemplate the digital world. But there's also that complex kind of societal, what's socially acceptable and moral norms, and that's shifting as well. And so, in a way, if you're trying to cleave to a codification, that's quite complicated to do when you've got all these moving parts.
And what you can't do is you can't say one person knows everything. You, Rob, are the chief ethics officer, and therefore you are the one that has to make all these decisions. Because the truth is they are complicated. And look, some ethical issues are easy. Christian, you and I could agree lying, cheating, and stealing, that's off the limits. You can't break the law. But there are a lot of other issues that are very gray. And everyone can have a different perspective on it. It depends on your life experiences. It depends on your upbringing, your religion, your nationality, what you were taught by your parents. So what I've really found is that you need to build a diverse team of people that have had a lot of different life experiences. Like if you're dealing with discrimination, who am I to decide whether a particular item or a particular phrase is discriminatory? I've never faced discrimination in my entire life. So I've really come to value the benefit of diverse perspectives. I want to walk into a room where people look different than I do. And that tells me that we're probably going to come to a better decision because we're going to get a lot of different perspectives and ideas on the problem.
Right, because otherwise you could just have a meeting in a very small confined space with yourself.
Yeah, well, I mean, why do if everybody in the room looks like me and has my background, why do we need everybody? I think in some workplaces, being different is uncomfortable and embarrassing. We at Airbnb try to look at it as if what makes you different is what makes you valuable, and that is your superpower. That's what you are bringing to the room that no one else brings. There's an individual at Airbnb who I write about in the book. His name's Shren. And Shren's been confined to a wheelchair since a very young age. But Shren brings an incredible perspective because Shren has actually traveled the world and tried to stay in different short-term listings and tried to get into listings that say they are they accommodate the disabled, but they're 2 steps leading up to the front door, or the front door is not wide enough, or there's no bar in the shower, or nothing to grab onto next to a toilet. These are things I've never thought of before, but what makes him different makes him invaluable.
And one of the things I thought was fascinating, but when you talked about setting up a code of ethics, is it's not something that you impose on the organization, which I think is the traditional mold. We will decide what the values are and we will propagate them aggressively through posters and other devices, and then we'll just hope they stick. Whereas what you've come up with is much more of a thing that says, let's have a collaborative discussion, get all sorts of different people in the room. And I love, there's a great example, I think you quote about the policy on bringing dogs into the office and saying that shouldn't just be a decision for, and I'll paraphrase and add some things that weren't necessarily, shouldn't the dog-loving CEO shouldn't be, or the dog-hating CEO is not a great arbiter for whether that's a good policy.
Well, that's right. Sure. Well, again, like what we talked about earlier, there are 3 ways to approach this. One way to do it is you don't really care about ethics or integrity, but you feel like you got to have a code of ethics. So what a lot of companies do is they just go online. They Google code of ethics. They find some other company's code, right? And then the irony, right, of stealing a code of ethics. They copy and paste it. They put their own company's name up at the top. The funny thing is sometimes they forget to check, and there's something in the body of it that refers to the old company, right? And then they email it out to everybody. And they say, check a box and say that you've read it. And then, boy, thank goodness we've dealt with that problem. We don't have to look at it again. All right, so that's one group. And then the second group is where one person figures out that they know everything. And they go off like Moses to the mountain and come back with a code like the stone tablets. And they say, here it is. I've got it all figured out. Everybody follow my rules. Well, that doesn't work either. So, what you need is a code of ethics should reflect a company's culture, what it really stands for. It ought to be unique to a company. And it ought to be something that people feel ownership over. The reason there isn't a lot of talk about code of ethics in a lot of companies is because people feel so divorced from it, because they never even had one thing to do with it before it was promulgated. So make people feel like they've got some ownership and a stake in it and a voice in it, and then they can embrace it. And I love that because some of the examples you give, it's sort of, when codification hits reality, you've got to make sure there's enough people who've experienced reality that understand. It's that classic business problem of what the boardroom thinks is going on the ground isn't necessarily what's going on the ground. And actually,
given it's policing every single person in the company, you do need those differing perspectives. And I love the example you gave with the dogs. You know, if you're going to bring dogs into the that has a physical consequence. So let's get the person that has to potentially clean this stuff up to be involved in that. And it seemed kind of obvious to me, but it doesn't seem to be obvious in the thinking of a lot of people.
A lot of the stuff in my book, you know, and again, I'm guilty of this too, because I was out at other companies and I was, you know, doing making the same sort of mistakes that I just laughed at a minute ago. But when you stand back and think about something and ask, well, why is it always done that way? You know, when you really think about it, it doesn't make much sense. You know, there's a number of things in the book like that. It's like, you know what, this isn't the way it's usually done, but wow, if you think about it and start looking at some science, there's a much better way right there in front of us. And
I find it interesting because as you were talking about these things in the book, and as you talk now, I think the stone tablets thing is really powerful because we're so used in society. We sign up to someone else's terms. So if I join a gym, I have to accept their terms and conditions. If I download iTunes, I'm forced to accept their terms and conditions. I'm part of a religion. It's stuff that's been you know, I mean, there's a good example of stuff that doesn't speak modern language. And yeah, I mean, there's some principles that are great, right? Not murdering someone still good today. Some of the other nuanced pieces, perhaps less relevant in this world. And I think it is interesting that you've taken an issue that's around human behavior and human decision-making, and particularly decision-making when no one's watching, and sort of gone, actually, this model of inherited stone tablets is by default not going to speak to that individual because they're going to go, well, this was written by someone who doesn't understand the world I'm in, and therefore they weren't contemplating this situation.
Sure. Well, you don't read the iTunes agreement when you check the box. And I think everybody's gotten used to this idea of being bound by rules that they have no voice in, and they simply check a box. And I think it's no wonder people don't care about it or they're cynical about it because it doesn't seem real to them. So I think it can be so powerful to give people a voice in this. And what we did at Airbnb, beyond people giving people a voice, the other thing we looked at is, well, why does the general counsel / chief ethics officer, why are they the only ones that get to make a decision about what's ethical? Some of these problems are really hard. And by the way, people are scared to come talk to the general counsel. I mean, nobody wants to go talk to the general counsel. That's scary. Nobody wants to go talk to HR because that's problems. So what we decided is, why can't ethics be owned by everyone? So we created this role called ethics advisors. And these are volunteer side jobs in the company, right? You're still an engineer, you're still in sales, you're in marketing, you've got your day job. But what we got 30 people to do was raise their hand and volunteer to be ethics advisors. These people got extra training on the code. We all formed a group. We formed a Slack channel and an email group. And then what we do is we tell employees, if you've got an ethical challenge, you don't have to go to HR or report something to the hotline and be a whistleblower. You can just walk down the hall and go talk to your friend who's in your department and get their view on things. And if it's an easy question, the ethics advisor can just give the answer. If it's a little more nuanced, they can then toss it on the Slack channel, send out an email to the other ethics advisors, and everybody can weigh in with diverse perspectives so that we get consistency. What we found, first quarter of this past year, for example, we had almost 100 inquiries to ethics advisors. Imagine that. That is 100 issues that never would have shown up in any hotline because they were relatively small. No one would have bothered to go to HR over it. But they raised fascinating questions, and it raised everyone's awareness that ethics and integrity is something that's owned throughout. And the cool thing about it is, after we rolled the program out and talked about it for a while, we have over 75 people who have reached out wanting now to become ethics advisors, lining up, raising their hands. And that's what you want. You want a company, I want a company of 5,000 ethics advisors, not one.
But I love that crowdsourcing of the thing, because actually it comes back to the simple fundamentals here, which is ethics isn't, as you say, it's not just one person's view on things, because even if you had an ethics who's amazing at their job and all-seeing and omniscient, it kind of doesn't matter what they think, because if word gets out to the general public that there's something the general public doesn't like, then it kind of doesn't matter that your ethics person internally has gone, well, that sounds all right to me, because it's failed the bigger test. So the risk management around that crowdsourcing that makes a lot more sense, because then you've kind of kicked it around a bunch of people. You've got an opportunity to think about other dynamics and nuances, and you're not placing a heck of a lot of responsibility on one person that it's inhumane to expect them to be able to exercise.
That's right. No, that's the beauty of the whole program. The other thing about it is it doesn't cost any money. In other words, you don't have to go hire a whole bunch of people to do this. You take advantage. I think the strength of it is you take advantage of the fact that someone's in finance and in marketing and in customer support. They are dealing with issues that relate to their craft almost the entire day, but they're bringing that perspective to the table when they're looking at these problems. So an integrity program doesn't cost a lot of money at a company. A lot of it's just taking advantage of some of the expertise and the passion that already exist in your workforce.
And I thought the other thing I really liked was you recognize that there's a need to have rules. And so you talk, for example, about, senior people may not have relationships with anyone in the company, right? And we just have that very simple rule. And so that's an example of one that's strictly enforced. And you go, there's no room for shift on this one because we don't want any discussion. But there were other examples of things where you said, actually, there's a bit of leeway here. And we should look to disapply rules where it makes sense to disapply them. And I really like this balance, because when I look at traditional, it's kind of like it's either absolutely set in stone and, there's no deviation from this, which doesn't allow for permutations of situations where it might be appropriate to have a slightly different view on things, or it's a little bit wild, wild west, and it's kind of like we have some principles that can be interpreted wildly. And I like this balance of those two different dynamics.
Right. Yeah. I love specificity when you can get there, right? Because I think ambiguity and silence are the enemy of integrity. Because in those sorts of environments, people are free to interpret for themselves what they think is ethical. And what we've learned in looking at science is that people fudge. People give themselves the benefit of the doubt. Everybody thinks they've got integrity, but everybody looks at the world through their own biased eyes, right? And so they can, I was talking with Dan Ariely, who's a behavioral scientist at Duke University, and he said, interestingly, workforces that are made up of very creative people and very smart people are particularly susceptible to ethical challenges. Why? Because if you're really creative, you can come up with a reason to justify just about anything, right? And that's what ethics is about for a lot of people, feeling good about yourself. Can I do this and still feel good about myself? So if you're really creative, you can talk yourself into these sorts of things, and that's what heads you down the road to trouble.
And I love this idea because I think it's in the knowledge economy, it's really interesting because lots of companies hire quote unquote smart people, and we can debate whether they get that right, but that's the theory. So they have these smart people do smart creative things, and then they get treated like small children, which is kind of will impose these. And I've never understood that it seems to me massively contradictory because you've either hired really smart people or you haven't, but you can't kind of, if you treat very smart people as like or adults like they're small children, they're going to rebel against that thing. Equally, as you point out, if you let them do what the hell they want, they'll behave like small children.
Well, the one thing that science taught me in looking at this, there aren't necessarily good people and bad people. You might think, all we've got to do is just make sure we don't hire bad people. We'll figure that out right with a great interview question, right? Do you have integrity? The truth is there's the potential for good and bad in all of us. And what makes people behave their best? Well, I guess as a former prosecutor, my initial reaction would have been, well, if they're afraid of getting caught, right? If you tell people that you're going to be punished if we catch you doing this, that should make people behave better. Well, that's totally wrong. That's not the way that the thinking works at all, according to science. What we've learned is that people are very, very influenced by their surroundings and by what they perceive other people to be doing. So, give you an example. This comes out of the UK around tax collection and debt. Collecting tax debt is a big issue for any government, right? So there's a group in the government that takes a look at people who haven't paid their tax bill, and they send them a letter basically saying, hey, haven't paid your taxes, pay up. So what they did was they started experimenting with different language in the letter. They, at one point, added a sentence to the letter, one sentence that drove the collection rate up over 30%. All right? You know what that one sentence is? 9 out of 10 Britons pay their taxes on time. Right? That one sentence. Why did that one sentence change behavior? Because everybody wants to feel good about themselves. Everybody wants to feel like what they do isn't out of step ethically with what others are doing. So if people believe that everyone else around them is paying the taxes on time, then they're a lot more likely to pay taxes on time as well. But if they feel that everybody's cheating on taxes and passing it off and pushing the government away, then they're able to rationalize it. So if you want to create an environment that's ethical, what you need to do is you need to create an environment that's contagious around ethics. You want to create an environment where you talk about the fact that it's important, talk about the fact that it matters, talk about the fact that in our company we do things the right way. And when people buy into that and believe it, it creates a virtuous cycle where everyone starts to believe that everyone else is following the rules, so they do.
And there's a great thing you pick up. It really resonated with me was this idea of how you manage people's induction. And I've never understood the model, which sort of runs along the following lines. So you join a large organization, a large global organization, and the first thing they tell you is, welcome to this large global organization. We're global. And they give you a load of, we have offices in 8 million locations. And give you all this noise, and you kind of go, I know that because I applied to join the organization. I'm well aware of that fact. And they don't go through the process of going, what are these people thinking right now? And these people are not thinking, please show me your risk framework and please bore me about the stats. Don't give me marketing spiel. What they want to know is, where's the bathroom? How do I get coffee? Have I made a really bad decision? What is this place like? And then you move very quickly into what I call Velociraptor mode, which is the start of the first Jurassic Park movie. There's this scene where they try and introduce, and they talk about the Velociraptors testing the fences. You know, this idea of sussing out environment. And I always think when I join a new organization, it's always I'm a Velociraptor. I'm trying to work out what's the rules of the game here. Screw what it says on the wall. Screw it. What is it? What's the reality? Do I have to leave my jacket on the back of my chair? What time will people tut at me if I rock up? When can I go? How, what are the parameters here?
Yep.
And I think most induction training doesn't answer that question. It gives you the theoretical side of it and almost gives you the bit that you go, right, I now need to sniff out whether that's true. And what I really liked about you, the way you talked about it, is you said, well, I'm not going to let some junior HR person come and tell about the code of ethics. I'm going to personally go in there and I'm going to talk about real life situations as opposed to hypothetical extremities of theory that say don't steal and don't murder and those sorts of things. And I love that because I thought it was really powerful.
Yeah. When I first started doing it, we have this extensive orientation program at Airbnb. It's like 20 to 25 classes your first week. And I went in and said, I want to do a class on ethics. And they looked at me and said, you got to be kidding. We don't want the lawyers to come in and start talking about integrity. We don't want to drive people away their first week. I said, no. They did. And I had to talk them into giving me a half hour, although we later got it to an hour. And what we do is we take real life examples. I don't talk about the law at all. We talk about real life examples that people actually confront when they're at the company. And I start the talk by telling everybody, everyone in this room is going to have an integrity moment in the first 6 months at the company. And I want you to be ready for it. And we're going to talk about integrity moments that other people in the company have had in the past, how they handled it, and whether it was the right way or the wrong way. And we start talking about things like alcohol. How much should you be drinking when you're at a company event? What is a company event? If you go out after work with 3 of your coworkers to a bar, do the rules apply there? What about dating? Can you date your boss, even if both people consent to it? And these are real life ethical issues that people want to know the answers to. I was stunned at the reaction that I got when we did this program. They do blind surveys at the end of the week for all the new folks. Every week it was the number 1 ranked class in orientation. I had a woman come up to me at one of the last ones before the pandemic. She literally had tears coming down her cheek. And I'm like, oh no, what did I do? What did I say?
I love that. We automatically assume it's bad news, right?
Oh, yeah, sure.
You've just exposed her ethical inadequacies.
I know. So when I said, what's wrong? And she said, Rob, I came to work at Airbnb from X company, by the way, one of the big tech companies, right? She said, when I was there, my boss kept propositioning me constantly. I kept trying to put him off, but he wouldn't stop. She said, I had to quit. And that's why I'm here today. She said, I didn't trust my old company to do anything about it if I had reported it. So I had to leave. She said, you have no idea what it means to have a leader, one of the executives at a company, stand up in front of the room my first week and talk honestly about how belonging at work, having a comfortable work atmosphere is important, and how executives at the company have all pledged they're not going to engage in romantic relationships. And managers can't ask, propose, they can't be involved in relationships with anyone on their team. And that's core to the way that the company operates. She said, you have no idea what that means to me. She said, I've never been in a company that actually talks about this sort of thing, and it means the world. Thank you. And that's the sort of reaction we get. And it's so simple to do. But you've got to be human. You've got to be authentic. And, you can't record it and just hit the button. Right? And you can't have a mid-level HR person in there do it. The power is a leader walking in and delivering the message live.
And I think the framing of that is really interesting, because it's not a fire drill where you go, if the alarm goes off, this is what you do. And statistically, we know the likelihood is the only time the alarm's going off is when we have to do one of those rehearsals that we find really irritating and walk out of the thing and we grumble about the fact that we're stepping away from our desk. And then very, very occasionally it's a real thing. But most of the time, we know it's a kind of drill. And so we're kind of learning to tick the box in many respects, because we don't believe that's going to. And what I think is really interesting is the way you say it's going to happen. So what I'm telling you here is going to apply to you. So in other words, you've built a framework that says this isn't unusual. You're not weird if you're having these sort of thought processes. So don't shut them from your mind. It's kind of like it's naturally going to come up, which is the truth. But it seems very strange because most companies kind of go, if you have and it's just that if tells you everything you need to know, because there's a presumption that it may not happen to you, right? There's some stuff that's probably going to be relevant.
Somebody at work is going to offer to buy you a beer at a bar after work. What should you do? I mean, we genuinely talk about this. Or can you compliment anyone anymore? Can you say, hey, nice looking shirt, nice looking outfit? Can you hug anybody at work anymore? Right? Now, these are the questions that they're actually in the back of some people's minds. These are things that come up every day. But most companies, nobody ever talks about it. We think it's important to get it out, talk about how we deal with those sorts of things at Airbnb so everybody knows it. And it really resonates with people, right? Because look, there's a lot of fear at work. There's a lot of fear in the workplace these days. People read the stories about Me Too, people losing their jobs, people being sexually harassed. We want to take away some of that fear, get everything on the table. Like we have a rule at Airbnb, ask out once. If you're not a manager, if you're not in the management chain, if you're in the management chain, you can't ask. Can't engage in anything romantic. There's no consent. You just can't do it. If you're on the executive team, the whole company's off limits. You just can't do it. Now, otherwise you can, but you can only ask someone out once. If they say no, you have to drop it. That's it. You can't ask them out again. Doesn't matter if it was a soft no, like, oh, my friends are coming in from out of town again, my dog's sick. No, if they're really interested, they get to ask you out one time as well. But that makes everybody comfortable. Everybody knows the ask out once rule. So that way, if somebody asks you out once and you turn them down, you don't have to worry about them coming back and bugging you over and over again. That's the way that we handle things, because the office isn't a bar, right? It's not something where you can be persistent and there are no consequences, because the other person can't leave. And not only can the other person not leave, they got to do their best work. And that's very important to us as a company as well.
And the bit, again, I like about that was that it's founded on realism. And you talk about this again in the book, which is this idea. And there was a certain well-known fast food chain in the UK that had a very simple, no relationships. And it's absurd, as you point out, to just sort of go, hey, when you enter this building, right, switch off all your human faculties. And the bit I find really funny is switch off the human faculties. Keep the ones that we need for you to do your job switched on, which may involve emotional intelligence, but switch it off when it comes to this other. I mean, it's just absurd. And I like the fact that what you've done is taken a situation and gone, one, let's accept this is going to happen. The situations we cannot allow it to happen, so we'll ban it there. But for everything else, we'll build a construct that will allow people to be people, but we'll curb it before it gets. And I love that realism that you brought.
Well, it's Airbnb. The whole notion behind the company is belonging. They want people to feel like when they travel, they're having an immersive experience where they can actually get to know people from another culture in another place and feel like they're at home and like they belong. Well, you can't have a mission like that out in the world and have a workplace where people don't feel comfortable. You have to understand your company's purpose. Like the rules for Airbnb's code of ethics, they wouldn't necessarily work for other companies. That's fine. I think every code should be unique, and it should be framed around who the people are and what the company's unique purpose in the world is. What is its North Star? You start there, right? And then build something that works for you and your company's mission.
So you talk in these terms, and I'm loving this, right, as I knew I would, but it's not common at all. The reason you get to write a book about this stuff is that loads of other people aren't doing it. And I find it astonishing when you articulate it in those terms. And sure, I can make excuses and go, well, Airbnb is a relatively new company and they have a business model that has you. But that's not true. You know, there's lots of other companies that are new that don't get this right. There's lots of companies that have been around for a long time who frankly ought to know better and have seen. So why is it so hard for people to get this?
I think it's because the old way of thinking about business. Remember, for decades, we've been living under this business exists for one reason only, to make money, to get big, right? Shareholder value. And that means that the leaders at a company put all of their attention on that bottom line financials. What's happening is the world is evolving away from that now to a stakeholder approach. And a stakeholder approach is companies need to have a purpose beyond making money. Profit is not purpose. What's your North Star? Why are you good for the world? And who are your stakeholders? Who are the people, who are the groups that you should be looking out for? So when you take a stakeholder approach, one of your stakeholders has got to be your employees. You have an explicit obligation to really look out for those employees and make sure they are doing well under this sort of thinking. So I do think that this new type of capitalism, the stakeholder capitalism, is really starting to get companies to think more about employees. And by the way, if they don't, the employees are not shy. What we are seeing is a new empowered employee now, right? In the past, if employees didn't like what was going on in the office, what happened? What did they do? They didn't do anything. They were quiet. They were scared of losing their job. They were afraid of speaking up because their voice had no power. Look at Susan Fowler. Susan Fowler wrote a blog post that completely upended Uber, a major company, ended up with their founder being thrown out of the company and CEO, all because someone had the courage to speak up. And what we're seeing more and more is employees are talking to each other on Slack. They are organizing. They're posting on Glassdoor, posting on Blind, blogging, tweeting, and if they still don't like it, they're walking out. So, like it or not, companies need to listen to their employees and recognize them that they're key stakeholders and they deserve attention and respect. And if you get in front of this and treat them that way, help them feel like they truly belong and matter and make a difference, it's a superpower and can propel your company. If you don't, it will be a constant drag on you as a company, a weight around you, right? A weight on your back that will keep you from reaching your full potential.
And it really struck me that I think you've tapped into something there that is generation. So it's technological, it's generational, it's social. And there's always been this interesting idea that senior people have the wisdom and they've been around for ages, so they know how the world operates. And therefore, why would we let junior people, we wouldn't let junior people into the boardroom. What do they know? And my argument is, which is beautifully, is kind of, well, actually, they understand a whole lot of stuff that you don't, right? Which is whether that's technology, whether that's social trends, whether they've just got a grip on the world that is different to yours. And so you're going to be blindsided on certain issues. And therefore, actually, when things go wrong in companies, someone somewhere knew something. They may not have known the full extent, but they kind of had an inkling. So why aren't you using that as an early warning system and going, let these people have a voice and speak up, and most importantly, listen to it? Because that's the best bit of risk management that's out there, because your customer service operative, who you may not view as being particularly senior in the organization, he or she is the person talking to customers. So they're going to get this hot feedback and know what's going on in a way that you're not. And so I find it astonishing, just from a logical perspective, again, that you don't follow the path that you've set out, because it's just like you're leaving really valuable data on the table in a way that could, you can avoid having your company get into trouble if you enable these people to be heard and feel part of what's going on.
I think too many people confuse age with wisdom. and really, I think young people may not have as much experience, but sometimes experience can be like blinders, and it can be a weight on your back because you are so used to seeing things done a particular way. Younger people understand the world in a different way. They've got a perspective that you need to be listening to, just like you need to be listening to people of different genders, sexual orientation, race, nationality, because they're bringing something to the table that's new and different that you need to be hearing, or you're going to miss it. I think people will look back in 20 years and laugh at the board of directors that we have at companies today. Right? Because boards today are primarily almost all male, almost all white, almost all former CEOs or CFOs. That's it. I've just described the boards of right? And look, I'm old and I'm white, and that's fine. I can bring a certain thing to the table. But I also believe that there's a lot of wisdom out there from all genders, all races, all nationalities, all ages, and all backgrounds and experiences. And boards need to diversify and get their different experiences into that room, right? Because right now, I think they are they have smart people in the room, but their perspectives are narrow because they're all very similar.
I think it's really interesting at the moment when you look at, you might have been running business X pre-corona, and you're now running, probably a business with remote workers. There's a lot more stuff done virtually, where ethics is being at the forefront now. So you make a minor decision, it can have ethical ramifications that it might not have seemed to have before. So there's a lot of people, I think, there that are blindsided by this stuff because they have grown in a system and a world and kind of got senior in that old world, and so they think in those terms. And as we've seen with what's going on with COVID, it's just changing overnight. So that, the perspective you've got, the thing that got you to the top of the ladder isn't necessarily going to be helpful in navigating this brave new world.
And I think some of it's almost everybody waits their turn and people work their way at the chance to be senior. And everybody's afraid to change the rules, because if they change the rules, then all the work that they did to get up the ladder may get thrown out the window. I think you have to change the rules a little bit. Value experience, but value diverse perspectives even more.
You've written the book, and the thing I love is you're clearly passionate about this, right? This isn't somebody who sat there saying, I'm going to think through, how can I make money out of a book, right? You've taken this thing that you've come across and your life experience speaks towards having to solve this and kind of going, this is how I think we can do this better. And so you've written this thing, and it feels to me like it's a little bit of an evangelical mission. And I mean that as a compliment, not as a kind of criticism. How are you finding that experience, and where do you want to take this?
I've really enjoyed it, and that surprises me. I never thought I'd write a book. To be honest with you, I was the general counsel of AirBnB, and I was doing this program and loving the program. And my wife used to be in the publishing industry. So my wife says, this is fabulous stuff. Other people aren't doing this. You got to write a book. And I said, I'm not going to write a book. You got to give me out of time. I got a day job. She said, this is your chance to have a bigger impact on the world. You need to do this. She said, I'll get you a writer, and I'll get you a major publishing deal if you'll do it. I'm like, oh, yeah, sure. Yeah,
whatever, right.
Give me a major publishing deal. I'll write the book. Well, that was my mistake, because she did. And 2 months later, I'm sitting down with a writer giving the writer every Monday night for a year and a half to do this book. And I'll tell you, Christian, by the time I was done with the book, I realized that this stuff was more important to me and had the ability, I think, to have a broader impact on the world than being a general counsel. And that's when I said, you know what, I think I'm going to step away. I've been practicing law for 35 years. I'd like to spend some time talking about the concepts in this book and hopefully influencing some other companies. And I'll tell you, that's been great. I've gotten such a positive reaction to the book and the concepts. I've already got a number of companies that have come to me and are saying, Rob, we'd like for you to work with us and help us build something like that into our culture. And so, look, the book's been out for a couple of weeks. I've already got a half a dozen companies that I'm starting to work with. And I'm thinking, wow, this is really cool. I believe the world needs companies to step up. The world's got big problems, Christian. I think all of us are concerned that partisan politics has so divided our governments that government can't be counted on to solve these things. I think we need companies to do this. And I'm really hopeful that if I can work with some companies and get them to weave integrity into their game and the way they do things, that can help make them even more successful. And we can start dealing with some of these challenges. So that's what I'm passionate about.
I love it. And I think there's an interesting point there, which is, if you, as you say, we end up in this sort of partisan world and everybody's kind of retrenching a bit. And if we look at what's going on in the US, we've got similar issues here in the UK with regards to Europe. And there was actually another guest on the podcast recently who was talking about, actually, if you look at companies, they are cross-border. They think globally. They have to impose, particularly if it's manufacturing or other you're imposing these single standardized approaches across the world. So there's an opportunity to kind of go under the radar in a way that it sort of doesn't matter what the noise is from the politicians. It's like you can really make some change on the ground, these things, and do it globally, which is the powerful bit.
That's so powerful, right?
And I think that's a really exciting, interesting mission. And the bit I also like about it is that global piece brings that diversity that you're talking about. So if you happen to have a global footprint, you can bring someone from Japan who'll come with a perspective. You can get someone from the US. You can get someone from Africa, to have these different pieces. So I think there is a real stealth mechanism there, if you like, to get the word out in a way that...
Don't tell me that.
So I think that's incredibly exciting. And what has surprised you most about the resistance to it? Because you talk in the book about, the logical thing people do is they go, oh, but what about? And then I think you say, there's people who come up with sort of obscure examples that sort of they think is the killer argument to destroy your piece. But what sort of other things are people, or any things around that people are kind of going, this is why we shouldn't do this? Because I'm always intrigued as to the rationale people come up with for not doing something that on the face of it feels right and seems right.
Well, this is about we're here for business, Rob. We're here to make money, and it's not my place to start telling people, what to do from some sort of a moral perspective. My response to it is, you don't have to tell people what to think religiously or about what their morals need to be outside the office. But if you want to create the best environment, the best workplace, you would need to step into the discomfort because people are looking to leaders to answer these questions. When you're running a global company, you're running a little country in a way. You really are. But one actually has the potential to do so much good, but you got to get everybody lined up in the same direction. I like to say that the leader is the thermostat, okay? Not the thermometer. A thermometer takes the temperature of the room. The thermostat sets the temperature. So a CEO leader is setting the integrity thermostat that everyone in the company is operating within. And everybody's looking at you to do it. They expect you to do it. This is what leadership is about. And you don't need to get into all areas of their life, but you do need to get into those areas that directly impact the business and directly impact the mission and the ability of people to get work done. They're watching, and you can't outsource it to the legal department. You can't outsource it to HR. This is what leadership's about.
And there's some case studies you feature in the book. But the sort of the summary argument that you could come from an employee perspective is, I come to work, I'm paid. You're not allowed to interfere with my private life. How dare you tell me how to behave? I think I know what you're going to say, but I think it's probably helpful for the podcast for you to just articulate the counter argument to that.
Well, yeah, I don't want to interfere with your personal life. The problem, of course, is that your personal life is increasingly woven into your professional life. And, when you have drinks with a coworker or you start asking them out, it's not just your personal life that's impacted anymore. It's the office. It's the culture of the office. So the office, I think, has not only, I think, the legal ability, but it has an obligation, really, to create an environment and a culture where everyone can do their best work. You don't have the right just to do whatever you want to do in the office. You have to operate within a certain framework for the good of the organization, all aligned toward that purpose.
I reflected as I was reading the book and you were talking now, this idea that your employer can exercise control, historically that was always the case. If you looked at it, sort of, there were in traditional times, employers had much more ability to kind of control it, and that was sort of accepted because I think in part because they provided something that was there in terms of whether it was accommodation and so to a certain extent, I think we've gone to this phase where it's sort of, very liberal. You can do what you want, be who you want. And I think there's an interesting piece that sort of says in the knowledge economy, as you say, the individual's ability to cause harm to the organization isn't just, you're not just a sort of unguided missile when you're in the office or logged onto the system 24/7. And you've got some lovely examples in the book around this is if you do stuff, it is likely to be tied back to your employer because it's not too difficult to find out who you work for these days.
Oh, LinkedIn, the internet, everyone can tie who you are back to where you work. And like it or not, that impacts the brand of the company where you work. It's really interesting, Christian. In the old days, there was a very fine line. There was a very strong line between your professional life and your personal life. Often you wore a suit. And when the suit was on, you were in your professional life. And when the suit was off, you weren't. Boy, today has that changed. I mean, now today, they are so blended, they're almost indistinguishable. When we're working at home with kids running around in the background, we can't leave our homes. We aren't working 9 to 5 anymore. We're always on, it seems. So it does make it really challenging, I think, in order to kind of figure out where does the obligation of the workplace end? Where should it go when it comes to creating rules and the like? And I think it's an interesting, thoughtful exercise that you need to go through. That again goes back to the power of diversity. You don't want one person to answer those questions. You want to sit down as a group and figure out, hey, where are we comfortable? How are we going to do this?
And I think that's an interesting thing because if you've got this collective approach, the crowdsourcing approach to this stuff, nobody wants their employer to overreach. And so if you've got a bunch of people all going, that feels too much, then you kind of probably have stepped too far with that piece and it can kind of calibrate itself.
That's right. Yeah, well, that's the benefit of the group thing, right? You can get a lot of early feedback right away when you're in the room talking through these things and working through it. So again, that's the power of, don't let one person just go off and make all the rules. You need to make sure it really reflects the culture and what the employees are comfortable with.
Final question from me, and I know the answer to this could be read the book, which obviously I highly recommend, and we'll put details of it which in the show notes. But like, if you were to say to people, okay, so they recognize that what you're proposing is miles away from what they have in their own company, what's kind of one thing they could start to do that would at least get them moving in the right direction?
Well, it starts at the top, because if you have a leader that cares about doing the right thing and really wants to do good in the world, Christian, all things are possible, right? But if you have a leader that cuts corners ethically, all they care about is how big can we get, how fat can our pockets get, or the individual leader's pockets get, you're going to have a hard time turning around that company yourself because it starts at the top. So for me, this is about, if you're a leader, really thinking through what matters to you. Do you want to do the right thing? And frankly, do you want to build your business to be a successful business in this new 21st century world where integrity really matters? If so, it won't just happen automatically. Integrity is something that you have to pursue with intentionality. And if you're willing to go down that path, I think the rewards are tremendous for you. But as a leader, you can't abdicate responsibility. You've got to own it, step up, and be willing to have those authentic human conversations with people about what you care about and what the right thing is.
That is a fabulous note always to end. Rob, listen, thank you so much for your time, but also thank you for writing the book, because genuinely it's one of those ones that I just devoured it. Well, actually, I had the audio book because I loved you reading it to me, but I've also got the physical one and enjoyed reading the whole thing because it just kind of really inspired me. So thank you for writing that. I wish you genuinely the best of luck with your mission, because I think it's a really important one. And look, I know my listeners are going to enjoy this. So contact details and everything else for you will go in the show notes. But thank you so much for the book and being on the podcast.
Well, I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity and the time to talk about this, Christian. Thank you.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My massive thanks to Rob for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about his book, Intentional Integrity, see the link in the show notes. As I say, it comes highly recommended. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. If you want to subscribe, you'll find it wherever you get your quality audio content. It's on all the podcasting platforms. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.